Hello, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy for Flourishing. I'm Craig Biddle, and I'm joined by my colleague, John Hersey. Today, we're going to talk about something called the presumption of liberty. And I want to juxtapose or contrast this idea with what I call the presumption of altruism. Now, the presumption of liberty is an idea that a lot of libertarians embrace and use in an effort to advocate or uphold the idea of liberty. And there's a grain of truth to this idea. It's actually got a logical foundation that's sound. The problem is that it's insufficient in the way that people try to use it, or the way that some people try to use it. So I want to just get on the table what this general idea of the presumption of liberty is. I'm quoting Tom Palmer here. He puts it nice and tersely. Quote, "The presumption is that you have a liberty unless there's a good reason to restrict it. And the burden is on the person who would restrict your liberty to justify the stricture, not on you to justify why you should have the freedom to speak or act or trade or the like." So you get the idea. It's the idea is that, look, if somebody's going to say, look, I can use force against you to stop you from, trading this good or making this profit or speaking your mind or whatever, that the person has to present a good reason for that, right? The default position is essentially liberty. It's freedom. And this ties in historically with, John Locke's and other thinkers' view that the natural state of man is a state of liberty, of freedom from force. And it's not until he's in an some kind of an unnatural state where other human beings might be using force against him that this business of some interference with that liberty comes into play. And what this idea is doing is it's taking that as the starting point, the idea that, we're kind of we're born free in effect. And it's integrating that with the logical idea, the idea from logic called the onus of proof principle, which in Western jurisprudence is known most widely where it's applied to law. So a person is to be presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, right? And that's an instance of the onus of proof principle, or the burden of proof principle, as it's sometimes put. And the idea here is that the person who asserts a positive, if I say John, committed a murder, that's a positive. That's a statement of a thing that I'm saying happened. Well, then the burden is on me. The burden or the onus is on me to present evidence and give reasons why I'm right? The alternative would be that John would have to prove a negative. If I can just assert that he committed a murder and I don't give any positive evidence to support that idea, John would be stuck in the position of having to say, well, I didn't commit the murder. And if I said, well, prove that you didn't commit it, what on earth could he come forward with to prove that he didn't do something if I'm just going to arbitrarily assert it? Now, there is a sense in which you can prove a negative, right? If I say John committed a murder and the murder was committed here in California, and John can, on X date, it was committed here in California at a certain time, and John can prove that he was in China during that time, then the fact that he's got something that contradicts my claim, he can prove something that contradicts my claim, that can serve as proving a negative in effect. But it's doing so by proving a positive. I was here, I couldn't have been there. Right, so that's the kind of thing. But the idea in logic is that you really can't prove a negative if it's just something somebody can assert without giving any evidence. Because if John says, "Well, I was in China," I could say, "Yes, but you had a special weapon that could reach all the way here to California from China. Prove that you didn't have that weapon." Right? You could see how this would just go on into this bizarre infinite regress. And what the presumption of liberty is trying to do, this idea of the presumption of liberty, is trying to grab this principle of logic that the onus of proof is on he who asserts a positive, And it's trying to say that in the realm of politics, this applies. And if I'm going to say, hey, John, I get to use some force against you in this context, or some government gets to force you to do X, Y, Z, you're justified logically in saying, well, actually, no, you have to demonstrate proof. You have to prove that you have the right to do this, and that you have the authority and the moral authority to use this kind of force. So I'm trying to give a steelman version of why people think this makes sense, and there's a real sense to this. It's not a complete BS idea. The problem is that it's usually applied while completely ignoring the cultural context in which we are trying to defend liberty. The problem is not that people don't understand this principle of logic, the onus of proof principle, or how it might apply in different places. The problem is that people have another presumption in their mind, and that is that the morality of altruism is true. And this brings us to another thing that we have to get on the table here. So the morality of altruism is the idea that being morally good consists in selflessly serving other people. Another way of thinking of it is if somebody needs something, then you are morally obliged to provide that thing insofar as you can. Their need constitutes a claim on your life, your time, your effort. And if that's true, if it's true that if John has wealth and I need wealth, that for him to be moral, he has to give me wealth, then, and if people accept this idea, which people largely do, I mean, not so much that directly, but almost everybody today embraces this idea that being moral consists in selflessly serving others. And if that's true, then this is completely at odds with the presumption of liberty principle. Granted, the presumption of liberty principle is anchored in a logical principle, and so it's got some real grounding. But moral ideas are what really motivate people to act. People don't think in terms of, well, what's the logic on this? They think in terms of what's morally right and what's morally wrong. This is what drives people, particularly in the realm of politics. They want themselves and their neighbors and the government to force people to do the right thing if people won't do it. So those are the two different ideas. And I just wanted to initially just get on the table what the two ideas are and a preliminary understanding of why I think they're in conflict. Now, there's a lot to say about why they're in conflict. And I want to get you in on this and get your thoughts on this idea and these two ideas.
Yeah, you indicated that there's a moral idea that's in conflict with a political idea. And I think just to underscore here, morality is more fundamental, and our political ideas are based on our moral ideas. And to the extent that we accept moral ideas that conflict with our political ideas, those ideas will tend to, the moral ideas will tend to win out. So it's not as if we've got two ideas that are on the same level and we just have to figure out, okay, which one are we going to choose? It's that if we accept one, it actually fundamentally undermines the other one. And this is, you mentioned that this presumption of liberty is common among libertarians. Libertarians tend to be a broad tent movement that don't subscribe to any particular code of ethics or morality. And the dominant code of ethics, of course, is altruism, this idea that one has an ethical duty to sacrifice for other people. We can talk more about the cultural context and how this idea succeeded the Lockean idea that you mentioned, this presumption of liberty is based on. And if you look back to the early 20th century, you had intellectuals like Frank Goodenow Johnson, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. The progressives, basically, around this time, the theory of evolution in the 1890s became popular. And people took that to mean that these theories of rights, which ultimately are based on the idea that rights come from God, now have no basis. If we evolve and things don't just unfold as laid out in the Bible, then we have a reason to believe that anything based on this idea of God is also false. So if we're going to be scientific about this, then we have to recognize that there are no such thing as God-given rights. Rights are given by the state, and the state has to do what's moral, what's good for the state, for everybody in the state. And so the state has the ability to, decide who should win and who should lose in these cases of, quote unquote, competing rights. So just a few thoughts, I think, going back to this idea of moral and political, that these things are not on the same level. One's more fundamental than the other, and one undercuts the other.
Yeah, really good point. That hierarchy is a big part of the issue, and the historic context here is really interesting too. You mentioned thinkers in the early 20th century, but in the 19th century, there was a real movement toward this business of altruism being not only right on biblical terms, but right more on secular terms. So you had the whole rise of the utilitarian movement, which consisted of, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham famously said, the idea of imprescriptible rights is nonsense upon stilts. And they were very much in sync with the positivists. So Auguste Comte, the French philosopher who coined the term altruism, and his understanding of the way in which rights are completely incompatible with altruism. So liberty is completely incompatible with altruism, is pretty profound. I'll read here from his Catechism of Positive Religion. Now, this was an effort at secularizing morality along with the utilitarians. And here's the way that Comte puts the idea of rights in contrast with the idea of altruism. He says, because to live for others is for all of us a constant duty and the definitive formula of human morality, it follows that all honest and sensible men of whatever party should agree by common consent to eliminate the doctrine of rights. He continues, altruism cannot tolerate the notion of rights, for such notion rests on individualism. On the premise of altruism, he continues, rights are as absurd as they are immoral. The whole notion then must be completely put away. And that you can't get any more explicit than that. I mean, the idea here is that you can't have rights, you can't have the right to act on your own judgment, to be an individual, to segregate yourself from others to the extent that you choose to, and say, no, I'm going to do these things for myself. He says, no, that's not only immoral, it's also absurd that you have that. There's no such thing. And this goes back to why Jeremy Bentham said that rights are nonsense upon stilts. Right? The problem here is that altruism had already been, for millennia, the accepted morality. Right? It's through religion, primarily Christianity here in the West. The idea is that being moral consists in living in effect like Jesus did, like sacrificing for others. Jesus on the cross is the quintessential sacrifice for all of mankind. Right? So this idea is already rich in the culture. And after the Kantian Revolution, where Kant said that he had to limit reason to make room for faith, and he saw the secularization of the West coming in, so he wanted to try to save altruism and save this moral code of sacrifice from this secular approach that was pulling sort of faith and religion out of the culture and trying to replace it with, you mentioned, Darwinism and the like. And so there's this storm of intellectual conflict about what what morality is and how it's going to be supported if religion is no longer the bulwark for this. And so you've got these secularists trying to uphold it. And this became really problematic because if altruism is in some way upheld by reason, if there's a way to say that it's true that people should sacrifice, which is what Kant was trying to do and what Comte was trying to do as well. That's why it's called the Catechism of Positive Religion. He's trying to come up with an absolute but secular approach to upholding these ideas. And if it's true that morality is all about self-sacrifice and rights are supposed to be some kind of a moral principle, rights can't fit into that. They just can't. They don't. If you have a right to keep and use the product of your effort, then I can't say you also have a duty to turn that product over to other people who need it. That's a complete contradiction. And what was needed is somebody to come along and say, well, rights are not nonsense upon stilts. And the reason people were able to say they're nonsense upon stilts is the same reason that there's this thing called the is-ought dichotomy, right? Nobody could point to the facts of reality that give rise to moral principles. We're just taking altruism as morally correct because that's what we got from religion, and that's what we're now getting from secular philosophers like Kant and Comte and the utilitarians. But none of them are actually able to ground any of this in observable fact. There's no logical case for altruism. There are no facts that give rise to the idea that you must sacrifice for others. So it was just sort of coasting on the long train of religious thought and then the new secularists who were trying to uphold it and put down rights on the basis of it. It wasn't until Ayn Rand that someone said, well, actually, you can ground the principle of rights in reality, just as you can ground the rest of morality in reality. The big problem is, for other people, is that you can't maintain the morality of altruism while you do that. Because the morality that you arrive at when you say, hey, let's look at reality and try to figure out what values are and why we need them at all and why we need a code of morality, if we do, what you discover is that values are not the equivalent of altruism. Values and morality are not about giving things away to others. They're about gaining and keeping values and respecting the rights of others to gain and keep values so that everyone can live as human beings. And it wasn't until Rand came along with this solution to the is-ought problem, enabling us to derive morality from reality, and then in conjunction with that, or as a part of that actually, the problem of the source and nature of rights. Right? For forever, people thought that rights either came from God, or they were granted by government, or they didn't exist at all. Like those were your alternatives. And if they come from God, then you got to be able to prove they come from God, which nobody could do. If they come from the government, then they're essentially the same thing as laws. So whatever the government says you may and may not, you may do and may not do is what you can do. And this is why you get, rights are nonsense upon stilts. As who's the guy, Alistair McIntyre put it, the idea of rights is one with witches and unicorns, right? Why? Because there's as much evidence in support of all of them. And so it's a fascinating idea. Now we've gone a little bit off the track here about the presumption of liberty and the presumption of altruism, but I wanted to get our heads around the problem of altruism and what the wrestling match has been in this area. It's pretty clear how if you have a moral duty to sacrifice for other people, you can't have a moral right not to sacrifice for other people. I mean, that's just a direct contradiction. So I can see, I'll say one more quick thing about the libertarians and then let you back in. I know you've got plenty of thoughts on this too. So there's a sense in which the libertarians who advocate this idea of the presumption of liberty have a good point. It is true that if I'm going to use force against you, I have a logical obligation to justify that use of force. But people don't think that way. They think in terms of right and wrong. And so until I can say to you, look, I have a moral right to keep and use the product of a moral right, to keep and use the product of my effort, not a political right. Political right comes later. But first, I've got to be able to demonstrate that I have this moral right to do it, and that this moral right is not in conflict with morality. It dovetails with a proper observation-based morality. And the reason that libertarians don't take this approach is, as you mentioned, a lot of them don't want to grab onto a single moral code and say, no, this is the right morality. This is the morality that upholds liberty, because they want to have a big tent. They want to be able to say, no, if you're Christian or Muslim or secular or a nihilist or anything, you're welcome to join our group and say that you're for liberty, as long as you say that you're against the initiation of physical force. But the problem is that you can't be against the initiation of physical force all the way down unless you understand why force is factually immoral, and unless you can really get your head around the argument and the base for that idea.
So you talked about how the presumption of liberty, those that uphold it, say that you can't violate it without some sort of justification. We also pointed out that morality is more fundamental than politics. And so the question just becomes, okay, what counts as a justification? Is it enough to justify the use of force that a majority of people want to violate your rights, want to, for instance, vote in universal health care because people need health care, and so people need it, so we ought to mandate that everybody pays into a system and everybody gets universal health care provided by the government, that doctors have to work according to the system set up by the government. They've got to fill out X pieces of paperwork. They have to follow X procedures. The problem with the presumption of liberty is that it leaves open what the justification for violating rights can actually be. And the obvious go-to as a standard for that justification is the most prevalent moral code in our culture, which happens to be this idea that the public good, the good of the most number of people, the majority will, is what dictates what we should do. And so without answering the question of, what counts as a justification, you leave open the door to massive rights violations.
Yeah, well put. Well put. You can just take a few concretes. So think about the lockdowns, right? What is the justification for the lockdowns? For young people like you and me and other healthy people who are, under 70, there's no real danger to speak of in regard to this. I mean, there's some. It's not nothing, but it certainly doesn't justify us having to be as concerned as don't leave your house and don't shake hands with people, etc. So, what is the justification for the lockdowns? Well, it's so that you and I and healthy people won't spread a disease that can harm people who are elderly or have serious underlying conditions like that can exacerbate the problem. So altruism is at play there, right? It's sacrifice. You and I are sacrificing for others in engaging in these lockdowns, or we're being forced to sacrifice for others insofar as these lockdowns are law. And take another instance, just a broader, more historic instance, the draft. Why is it that there can ever be a draft? Well, you have a moral obligation to protect the well-being of the rest of the people in the country. And if you're between the ages of 18 and wherever the draft ends, then you have a moral obligation to do that. Is it a chosen obligation? No, it's not chosen. It's a duty. You have to do it. This is the idea of the draft. Or take the welfare state or the public schools, any aspect of the welfare state. Why do you have to pay into this, even if you don't have kids, right? Because you have a moral obligation to serve others, or as you put it, the greater good, the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the utilitarian version of altruism. And in all of these cases, that is regarded as a good reason to restrict your freedom. So I'll go right back to Tom Palmer's definition of this presumption of liberty. He says the presumption is that you have a liberty unless there is a good reason to restrict it. So it does. It hinges precisely on the thing you're talking about. What's the good reason? In the lockdowns, the good reason is, well, everyone knows you have a moral obligation to take care of the elderly and the sick. Ergo, you have to wear a face mask and not go outdoors, and that's X, Y, Z. And if your business is not one of the, quote, essential businesses, then you can't keep your business open. And likewise for the draft, right? What's the good reason that is justifying it? The good reason is altruism. It's or the utilitarian version of altruism, right? So in each instance, you're precisely right. The thing that all of this hinges on is what constitutes the good reason, what constitutes the justification. So there's no getting around the fact that the only way to defend liberty is on firm, objective moral grounds. And too few people understand that fact, and even fewer people understand how to understand the firm, objective foundation for morality and rights. And we talk about this all the time on this show and in all the work that we do. This is why Ayn Rand's ideas on this subject are so important, because she figured this stuff out. And, it's very difficult to figure it out. It's not that difficult to understand once somebody has figured it out and they explain it, and you can say, oh, wow, that makes sense. And you can concretize it yourself in your own mind as well. But this is the thing, and it's for libertarians in general. I have a lot of friends who are libertarians, and I think there are a lot of good people in the libertarian movement. But what they need to understand is you cannot skip morality in your efforts to defend liberty. You can't just go, we're going to jump from politics down to a principle of logic and say that here's the principle of logic says you have to do X, Y, Z. It doesn't work that way. You've got to take into account the context of what is in people's minds about right and wrong. And if what's in their minds about what's right and wrong is in conflict with liberty, is in conflict with the idea of individual rights, then that's where we have to put our time and effort, is helping people to understand what is the right morality and what is the right view of rights. And once people get that, there is no conflict about any of these things. There's no conflict between morality and rights, and there's no conflict between your interests and my interests, and there's no conflict of interests at all, at least not among rational men, as Rand put it.
Yeah, and for those interested in learning more about this moral basis, Craig, you wrote a great book on it, Loving Life, The Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts That Support It. I'd definitely recommend that in addition to, of course, Rand's works. But I mentioned Loving Life because if you follow the link in our podcast description, you can actually get a free ebook version of it, and I'd highly recommend it.
Sweet. Yeah, and definitely, I think that book is really helpful because it's sort of a systematic approach to the objectivist ethics. But Rand's work in general, just, if you like fiction, read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead or one of her fiction books, and you'll start to get your head around how it is she thought about these ideas and why they're so important. Because so many people in the liberty movement, they respect Rand and they understand to some extent what her ideas are about. But what they're not doing, I think, in a lot of cases, is they're not saying, all right, what's the strict sort of logic of an argument, and what is the function of moral thinking in people's understanding of what is going to be right and wrong in politics, right? You mentioned that politics is depends on ethics. Like ethics is more fundamental, and so whatever your views in ethics are, they're going to drive your politics. And this is the thing that people have to get. And Rand shows this in so many different places and in so many ways. An essay that I wrote that has a lot of Rand in it, all of my work has a lot of Rand in it, especially when it's about morality, is an essay titled The Creed of Sacrifice versus the Land of Liberty, which we can also link to, because that has some of the material about the utilitarians and Auguste Comte and the positivists and how it is that their ideas came up after the founding of this country and started to really poison people's thinking about morality and rights. Because they did. Our context today is not as clean, morally speaking, as was the context that the founders did their thinking in, right? They had Locke behind them and they were drawing from his ideas, and this stuff really made sense. It was like, okay, if somebody pulls clay out of the ground and builds something, then that thing is his because he caused it to come into existence, right? He caused the value. And the founders picked this up, and they had some mixed language in there about, rights coming from a creator and rights being self-evident and a few things like that. But the general idea that people were really going on is that there's sort of a common sense idea here that you have a right to act on your judgment for yourself and to pursue your own happiness, right? And they were playing on the common sense sort of thinking of the time. That common sense thinking got wiped out by the utilitarian, by Kant, and then the utilitarians and the positivists. And then on into the progressives, as you mentioned, in the early 20th century, who brought all of that to bear on politics, which is where we got the whole so-called progressive movement, right? And that there's no way to deal with these big ideas and that much history and that much stuff built into people's psychologies because of it, without getting down into the depths of real hardcore philosophy. And that's what Rand did. So to anyone out there who has this idea that this presumption of liberty is viable, I'm not going to say there's nothing there. There's a grain of truth to it all, and it's based on a logically sound idea. The problem is you can't skip morality. You just can't, because it's the thing that impinges on everybody's thinking about politics. So.
Well put. I hope you guys are all enjoying this show, and I hope you'll give us a 5-star rating and a thumbs up and subscribe and tell your friends about it. Anything else you wanted to add, Craig?
That's it. Thanks for joining us today. It's always interesting and fun to talk about these ideas, and we hope you'll join us again next week.